I was motivated by a real sense of optimism and a desire to design societies in such a way that we could minimize war. And I thought that the only way we could really do it was by actually understanding, by being really honest with ourselves about where does it come, how much of it is biological, how much of it is cultural.
This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And I am eternally fascinated by the question about the origins of war. Does war go back millions of years, as suggested by the fact that even our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, seem to wage war? Or is war something that emerged relatively late in the human story, only when we start building things and storing things that are worth defending? Long-term listeners will know that I have had two guests on the show who support the latter perspective. And some of you have written to me asking why only one perspective. Now, there is a personal reason for that. I, as many people, got familiar with this debate reading some of their first literature out there, trying to put some numbers on the warfare amongst non-state societies. They tended to talk about often hunter-gatherers living in this state of constant warfare. And frankly, I was very convinced by the rebuttal of that literature made by Douglas Fry, my guest in episode 8, and Brian Ferguson, my guest in episode 25. And so I wanted to have them here to share their thoughts with you. But I do think it's unfair to leave the topic at that. And so I've been looking for a scholar who disagrees with Fry and Ferguson, disagrees with the perspective that I have been subtly promoting on the show, but does so in a way that perhaps we can all be wiser after this disagreement rather than just half of us picking one side and another picking another. And I think Luke Glowacki, professor of anthropology at Boston University, is such a person. And so I decided to invite him on the show. We start talking about what exactly is the debate, where are there real agreements and disagreements. We continue talking about hunter-gatherers, how peaceful are the existing hunter-gatherers of our times. We talk about cave paintings, skeletons, the archaeological record for war, or actually the lack of any archaeological record from such a long stretch of the human journey. We talk about chimpanzees, bonobos, and what they can and cannot tell us about human warfare. We talk about the implications of all of this. What have we learned? Can we put anything into practice if we want a more peaceful world? And as always, you'll hear my guest reflections on humanity at the very end. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. If you do, please subscribe to the show here on your podcast app. And if you like newsletters, also at onhumans.substack.com. You can also leave a nice 5-star review to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you think that I've deserved it. And before we get the show started, I just want to finish quickly by saying thank you to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. And if you want to join those people, if you think that the work I do, making research in humanities and human science is more accessible and more meaningful to big questions about our self-understanding, you can do so indeed at patreon.com/onhumans. But anyway, without further ado, I bring to you Luke Glowacki. Professor Luke Glowacki, welcome to On Humans.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've had Douglas Fry on the show. I've had Brian Ferguson on the show. And I think it was about time to have you on the show. You disagree with them. What, in your words, is the disagreement? What is the debate about the origins of war?
Yes, that's a great question. For me, I see there's sort of two central areas of disagreement. One is whether you look at recent nomadic foragers, recent nomadic hunter-gatherers, whether they had war, whether they practiced war, whether it was important or not. So on the one hand, you have people that say, the vast majority of hunter-gatherer societies lacked war. On the other hand, you have the alternative camp is that war was something that was much more common and frequent among hunter-gatherers. And that touches on the second point of disagreement, which is really whether war was important in human evolution. Is war produced because of psychological adaptations to intergroup conflict? Is it something that was selected for, or is it something that emerged really recently in our history and has not left an evolutionary imprint?
Yeah, the position that's familiar to longtime listeners from Fry and Ferguson is that when you look at recent reports of hunter-gatherers, especially hunter-gatherers who do live nomadically, like you said, they would say that warfare is relatively rare. How much would you say that you take definitely the opposite position, which is that hunter-gatherers actually not only do they wage war, but they wage war chronically all the time, and that it has been a chronic constant phenomenon in human history.
Yeah, so I don't mean to imply that Fry and I disagree on everything. It's been very useful for my development as a scholar to read an alternative position, and Fry has sort of been at the center of that camp, pushing an alternative model of human evolution in which war, recently emerged. So his scholarship, along with Ferguson and a few others, has been really important for my intellectual development. Nonetheless, we still have like outstanding disagreements, but I would completely agree with him insofar as war was not this like incredibly constant, intense, severe thing that societies could not escape from, right? I don't think the evidence supports that sort of like strong Hobbesian position. I think it's likely to be like human groups everywhere. It's going to vary in intensity. It's going to vary frequency. It's going to vary in the scale of it. But I think that there's reason, just like we think human societies make war today, there's reasons to think we were probably doing something similar 50,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, possibly much deeper. And even if it was infrequent, it's very difficult for me to imagine a behavior that had such clear selective consequences, not resulting in adaptations in our psychology. Um, so that's probably where we disagree. But I think the characterizations of nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle as being one of chronic warfare are probably they don't accurately reflect the ethnographic record. And Fry has done a really great job of forcing me to think about that and confront that evidence. He's also done a fantastic job of forcing me to think about peace. Like peace is actually, in my opinion, the thing that really begs explanation. None of our primate relatives have anything approaching peace, yet we can have these sustained periods of durable, harmonious intergroup interactions. And this is remarkable. And to me, it's one of the most important things that we figure out how to understand. When did our species build this capacity? How do we maintain it? What are the conditions that cause it to collapse?
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that you are using peace there in a way that I think is very valuable, but I think it's maybe worth highlighting that it's quite particular. You're not saying that there are no other primates who might not be doing war, but you're saying that what we do is we can have two groups living close to each other and interacting constantly in a peaceful way, which is different than just letting the other one be and not caring about them, which is what you would see in many other primates, right?
Yeah, in most group living social species where they live in a group and there's other groups, they typically avoid each other. This is the most common strategy, behavioral strategy between groups of the same social species. And what we're extremely unique for is building these durable cooperative relationships where you can interact, you can have iterated interactions that can span weeks, months, or years, no expectation of violence. I don't, if I go to visit your community, I don't have to, if I'm a hunter gatherer, I don't have to constantly be looking over my back expecting to get massacred. I can trust in the stability of that relationship. And that's different than any other primate species, including bonobos. So clearly, bonobos are really different than chimpanzees. But even like on the sort of best case interpretation, I think for their intergroup interactions, it's hard for me to qualify that as peace when there is so much physical violence in those interactions, chasing around, biting, leaving wounds. I don't have the figures here, but if you look at my published papers where I quote directly from papers describing bonobo interactions, you can see it's a pretty substantial amount of interactions that result in physical aggression or injuries. So humans are doing something really remarkable. We can not just interact with others like bonobos interact, but we can also do so in a really sustained way with no expectation of violence. Where if there is violence, it creates this sort of like very serious breach of norms where people are sort of astonished at it. And Brian, I would probably agree that sometime like well in the Pleistocene, human groups were interacting peacefully, we were interacting cooperatively, we were trading with each other.
And you see this in the archaeological record, right? You see that at least by the time that modern humans, Homo sapiens, comes around, you start having trade of rocks, obsidian, or whatever
Yeah.
in Africa that
Mhm.
goes way beyond where any individual could have traveled in their lifetime.
Yeah, exactly. You see evidence of long distance lithic trade at the origins of our species, indicating that it's probably not one person carrying those lithics hundreds of miles, but extensive trade networks.
Yeah, yeah. And okay, so I promise before we finish, we have to get to this work that and the thoughts you have around this evolution of peace. But things do break down. And am I right that the thing that you might want to call war between these mobile hunter gatherers tend to be individuals originating violence, and then there's more this kind of feuding which originates with the individual rather than a group decision where we declare war on those people over there.
Yeah, I think the group dynamics are a little bit complicated. So two people have a quarrel, one of them picks up a rock and kills the other. I wouldn't count that as war. I think the crucial thing for war is it has to be coalitionary, right? It has to be a product of a group or endorsed by the group, reflective of the group's values or norms or the group's will. Even if it's one person who strikes the final blow or hits the spear, it has to be coalitionary. Typically, there's a single victim. Massacres start emerging typically when you have increasing levels of socio-political complexity.
No, I think that the reason that matters is there are these moments where one side is saying, oh, violence exists, but it exists in this kind of form, which we don't define as war. And then the other one says, yeah, violence exists in this form, which we define as war. And it's,
So I'm interested in using a definition that can apply to any human societies and can apply across species. So if you're saying war requires, say, complex forms of organization, by definition, the only requirements are it has to be between groups, it has to be coalitionary, and it has to involve killing.
yeah, okay, okay. Well, I think we've done enough groundwork to know where we are. There's broad agreements that, okay, no, we're not going to have an incredibly militarized existence where war is constantly there with big battles, etc. Even if we define war as this kind of more raiding, etc., it's not necessarily a constant fact of hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But there is a disagreement on is it common enough? Was it common enough in our evolution to have been a significant part of what, for the lack of a better word, we might call human nature? And let's start with the modern hunter-gatherers. What do you think? What do people like Fry? What do people like me, who has been very sympathetic with Fry's research, what do we get wrong when we read the ethnographic literature around modern day hunter gatherers and say, look, these are surprisingly peaceful people?
Yeah, so these are hunter gatherers who have been studied either by anthropologists or by missionaries or by government workers, say in the past couple of 100 years. So we have written records about their intergroup relationships. And people like Fry think that the most important types of societies is not just hunter gatherers, but hunter gatherers that are mobile. They move around, they don't store any food, they typically don't live in one place very long. So the vast majority of those societies, when they were studied, were already incorporated into state societies or surrounded by powerful agricultural neighbors. So you can have, say, like the San or the Bushmen or the Kung, who have been really extensively studied. We have a lot of demographic data on them, and we see that there's really not a lot of evidence of war recently, but at the same time, they're living within state society. They're living within Botswana and Namibian government. If you're thinking about what does that group tell you about how humans in a world of hunter-gatherers, how humans 50,000 years ago may have acted when it comes to intergroup relationships, they're not going to be that great of a model, right? They may be a great model for how does parenting work? How does foraging work?
Oh, that's an interesting point. Okay, I hear you.
But they're not going to be that good of a model for intergroup relationships. What you really want is hunter gatherers who are not living in a world of, say, state society or with a, colonizing force that's going to sanction them.
Well, good luck finding one.
Yeah, well, this is the problem. So this is one of the problems of that model. There's just not many groups of hunter gatherers neighbored by hunter gatherers.
And when there are, it's not also clear that there's a consensus agreement on whether they did war. I've seen Australia, Fry, by the way, raised Australia in one of his early works as a kind of great example of a relatively warless existence of hunter-gatherers. And then you have, I've seen other writers use pre-contact Australia as a great example of very warlike existence of hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
So there you're like, as a reader of this literature, kind of 3 steps after the original sources, you're kind of like completely lost of who should I even trust. I mean, and so it gets really difficult.
It gets really difficult. Nonetheless, when I read the ethnographic record, I see that intergroup coalitionary violence occurred in many, many of the societies that look like they only have minimal contact with the state, or they're not favored by, powerful agriculturalists who will just wipe them out. But that doesn't mean the alternative, the strong Hobbesian, that it was constant war. For me, it would be very strange. You had two human societies living adjacent to each other where there weren't conflicts that sometimes escalated to violence and involved coalitions.
Let me push back a little bit on something you said earlier about hunter gatherers living in these kind of places where they kind of don't have anyone to war with because they're just surrounded by these really powerful agricultural states. I don't know if that's right, because it's not like the Sun had no one to fight, or it's not like the Mbuti had no one to fight against. They can fight against other Mbuti people or other Sun people. Let me take, for example, Central African kind of rainforest hunter-gatherers. I had Cecilia Padilla Iglesias on the show, who has done some great work with them. And couple of conclusions from her work, if I may summarize, is they travel a lot. And they have this constant, they travel just areas that are kind of unimaginably large for us, for individuals to travel in their lifetime, meeting other, she wouldn't even want to really say groups, if honest. She was like, she said, she used color as an analogy. It's not like you have red and then you have yellow, you have a kind of gradient going from one to the other. And in these kinds of dynamics, I think that someone like Fry might come and say, look, they live in this big web of people very peacefully. And if it would be true that humans are relatively inclined for war, then you would expect humans living in a rainforest to form these kind of groups where they start warring. But lo and behold, when you live without food surplus, when you live without much storage, you actually end up forming these kind of quite peaceful networks of people. And that's evidence that this is kind of what they were probably doing 20,000 years ago when their ancestors were living in those same rainforests. And they have states by them, but if something happens in the rainforest, there's not going to be a policeman knocking on anyone's door, is my guess. But you correct me.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I think the areas that have been recently that, that you have ethnographic records on, are it's going to be vanishingly small, where you could have something that looks like war that's not going to invoke the state. Now, the state may decide it's not worth sort of like creating a bigger issue by prosecuting that person. But the fact that they're living outside the state, that's, I think, not an accurate characterization.
Okay. But what about then the characterization of them, the fact that they don't end up clustering in these very clear identities, people meet each other, go from camp to camp, suggests that maybe that's what the world looked like more 20,000, 30,000 years ago, where you have relatively low population densities, people move from place to place, and the general tendency is to try to find a way to communicate with someone and not form groups which could then even potentially wage war, because you don't necessarily get those kind of clear groups.
Yeah, so I would say, first off, with their social structure, they could still wage war. All you require is the capacity to form coalitions and to use aggression strategically. Nonetheless, the fact that they don't have really distinct social groups isn't incompatible with the fact that war may have a biological or psychological basis, that war may have been important in human evolution. What you expect is warlike behaviors to emerge in certain sort of conditions, and those conditions may just be met in in the Central African rainforests.
What do the hunter-gatherers fight about? Because there is the case that look like, especially if you're nomadic, you're not defending anything, you have the most obvious conflict resolution mechanism, which is walking away. You don't have centralized leadership who's going to force you because they have a ego stake in the game to go and fight for them. And you're not going to steal anything because there's not much food surplus. You're not going to enslave people and force them to walk with you around the forest. I mean, there is a kind of almost like logic-based argument. What do you think of the value of that?
Yeah, so I can imagine instances where, groups may come together at a water hole. Maybe there's not enough water for all of the members of groups, and this leads to a conflict between them that then results in a series of, retaliatory violence.
Fair enough. Yeah. That's a good description. I'm happy you painted it visually.
Nonetheless, it looks like generally, I think for hunter-gatherers on the basis of ethnographic, that material resources are less important than, say, groups that are sedentary, or say pastoralists, where they may be directly raiding. I've done a lot of field work with mobile pastoralists who raid for cows. And it's clear, material resources can create a big incentive for people to go raid. And for the most part, hunter gatherers don't appear to be ready for material incentives. But there is a lot of evidence from many different hunter gatherer societies that they will be taking children and sometimes adult female captives.
Okay, but what do you do with someone enslaved in a nomadic hunter gatherer situation? I know the sedentary hunter gatherers had slavery, but if you're moving around the forest all the time, then let's just run away. Like,
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't use the word sort of enslaved when I think about captives for mobile hunter-gatherer warfare because I think their social organization and their sort of like social worldviews is probably so different than ours, and that word has so much emotional valence.
okay, fair enough. I just think that if someone takes me as a captive and I'm living as a nomadic hunter gatherer, I'm just gonna run away next time I'm gathering some nuts from far away.
Yeah, you certainly might, and you read accounts where people do this. They may run away at a certain time and rejoin their kin group. They may run away and get killed. They may, eventually decide they want to stay. They may get pregnant with somebody's child in the village and not want to leave. They may have kin, and likely they probably have kin members in the group that took them. It's probably not a group of entirely strangers.
Okay.
And for me, there's a deeper problem with the nomadic egalitarian model, the nomadic hunter gatherer model of human evolution is that I don't actually think it's a very good model of human evolution, where groups like the San or Hadza are living in these. So these are contemporary hunter gatherer groups who use the model. They're living not just in safe societies, but they're living in these really resource scarce environments where there's not a lot of water. They're not the place you think humans would settle first, which is typically, resource abundant areas. They're typically living at very low population densities. You think the alternative model is that humans would probably settle in places that are more resource abundant, such as river valleys. And then they may stay there until sort of the carrying capacity is reached that they have to move on. So these would be like semi sedentary hunter gatherers who've been studied a lot and typically have much higher rates of inter-group violence. The reason we place such a priority on groups like the Kung or Hadza is partly just like a historical accident. But I think if you were starting from the ground up today, who should we think about for, say, evolution of the human species? We wouldn't necessarily look at a group that lacks surface water for part of the year and lives at astonishing low densities in one of the driest deserts in the world as a model for human evolution.
Yeah, people like Fry would also agree there that the sedentary hunter gatherers do have higher rates of war. So if that was a more common lifestyle in the human past, that would be a very important part of the puzzle. But there is, by the way, there is the point still the well. But when we look at archaeology, it just doesn't really seem to leave remains of much sedentarism before 10, 20, 12,000 years.
That's a formidable challenge, and I'd like to say that, there is some evidence more than you may realize or more than a night reader may realize. I had a paper published in 2022 with Manvir Singh and Evolution of Human Behavior, where we documented, I don't know, several dozen hunter-gatherer societies that had evidence of increasing sociopolitical complexity. Every year, it seems like there's more and more research coming out indicating that, like, wow, there are lots and lots or there's more societies than we would have thought that had levels of that were somewhat sedentary. For instance, I don't know if you saw this paper came out a year or two ago of a notched log at 400 and some thousand years ago.
100,000. That's before almost.
It's absolutely incredible. And the authors hypothesize it was, part of probably a fishing platform or some sort of, structure. But the fact that it's actually a log, it's not a small sapling like you would find, say, the San used to construct their huts, but an actual large log. You're right. There's not a lot of evidence that semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers were that common before, but I would say give it a little bit more time.
And it's an important point. I think that before we lose listeners into the weeds, I think it's important to just say that it has it's a very clear logical relationship with war, which is that there's a kind of fair enough argument, which is that if you have nothing to defend, you can just move away. But it is immediately when you start having a clear, like, say, this is my fishing platform. I put a lot of work with my buddies to create this fishing platform. Well, now you have something to defend, which someone else might want to take. which would potentially make war more likely.
Yeah. So there's a couple of other issues on the lack of like very good evidence for sedentary societies. And another is that just many of those areas are the first places that get pushed under agricultural land. You can think of like the Nile, like, whatever may have been there from 20,000 years ago, we're probably not gonna find. The third is more of a theoretical consideration. It's that the population density may be very, very different between a densely populated river valley and say, uh, area the size of the Kalahari Desert that has, that's the home of the sun. If you have a very densely populated area next to a lightly populated area, the sort of impact evolutionarily from that densely populated area is going to be likely be much more significant.
So even if there was a couple of examples of sedentary hunter-gatherers or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, they might actually be a big part of the overall pot of people, even if
Yeah.
even
Hmm.
if there's not very many sites. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Fair enough. I think that's a good place to keep moving onwards. I mean, if the ethnography doesn't bring clear answers, some people say that the archaeology will. There's two pieces of archaeological evidence we can look at. One is evidence of war in skeletal remains, violent trauma. The other one is cave paintings. What were people so interested in, so fascinated by that they wanted to paint it? Why don't you describe how you see the evidence at the moment? And then I'll do my best at, I don't know, pushing back.
Yeah. So cave paintings. I'm glad you brought that up. There's not a lot of evidence for Paleolithic hunter-gatherer or war among Paleo hunter-gatherers in Paleolithic art. You find it for hunting, you find it for maybe other things, but you don't find it. You do find it in war, but it emerges much more sort of recently.
Yeah. And by the way, to be completely open, this for me was when I first started reading about this. I think chimpanzees were the strongest, like emotionally strongest argument for war being natural to humans. And the lack of cave paintings about war was the emotionally most powerful argument for war not being quote unquote natural.
I agree that there is a substantial dearth of cave paintings on demonstrate Paleolithic art demonstrating war, to use a sort of more precise term. I don't know how to interpret it because it's so hard to interpret the artistic traditions. Surely, say reproduction was important, but do we see the equivalent amount of depictions of human reproduction, of either birth or sexual intercourse that you would expect? Many societies have taboos. Many sort of hunter-gatherer or tribal societies have taboos on mentioning dead people, the names of the deceased. Now, the only reason I mention that is it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around there being a taboo of ever mentioning anything like that. So we have no idea what the people, 40, 60,000 years ago were thinking or feeling. So the short answer is I recognize it's a real concern for this idea that wars of outstanding cultural importance during this period, you would expect there to be artistic reproductions. You don't find them. I don't know how to explain it, but you also don't find reproductions, say, of sexual intercourse.
Yeah, no place to see porn. Okay,
Yeah.
but to be honest, in I think the it's even it's a little bit. It is very surprising that there isn't for me, not just because you would think that things that are important, like reproduction, for example, should have paintings about it, but because there's so much of the hunting paintings and war is so similar. It's like in the same conceptual place. It's a group of people taking up weapons, doing something dangerous, which they think is really important. And you could, I personally feel like it's. I mean, I remember hearing someone describe war as just an extension of the human's capacity to do group hunting. Like once you
Yeah.
can do group hunting, you can do war. You just don't
Or
hunt a
mhm.
non-human anymore. You hunt a human, and
Yeah.
and that yeah, I think I do. I always pose at this. I'm like, it is quite striking for me the sparsity of anything remotely
Yeah.
similar to war. I mean, the only things we have is a couple of potentially dead people on the cave
Yeah.
paintings.
So yeah, it's a real concern. But let me ask you, how many Paleolithic images do we have from Africa? Aren't most of them from Europe? And maybe there were different dynamics between Africa and Europe. Certainly, there were at different population densities. Um, Second, you can imagine hunting being something that completely occupies people's lives. It's something that you're doing every single day. And lethal violence may be something that happens every 5 years. So you may expect there be a different distribution between.
Oh, that is a good point. I mean, Paleolithic art is just, it is such a fascinating experience to be kind of, even though I'm not even looking at anything right now, but just thinking about it, I get into this kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of beautiful space to be at, to wonder what is it saying, and we just don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. It's amazing. I've spent a lot of time in the American Southwest, and you have petroglyphs all over. So instead of being paintings, they're typically carvings, and many of them are from, um, from populations prior to Columbus. And you're directly witnessing something, seeing an artistic creation from a people who are like, they're so reachable and yet they're not.
Yeah. Gosh, well, what about the bones?
Bones, great question.
So they're the bones. I mean, I think the kind of take that you get if just look at any paper by the camp that you call the shallow rooters, the people who believe that war has very shallow roots in the human story. They would say is that not only that you do not find much evidence of lethal violence from older skeletons, but whichever area you pick, you kind of find a place where you have a time without evidence of war, either in the bones or in the kind of, I don't know, weapons or fortifications. And then you see it emerge. So you can kind of pinpoint the moment when it emerges. The earliest moment would be something like 14,000 years ago in one place, but in many places much, much later. Um, yep, sounds convincing. So what's your, what does he get wrong?
Yeah, so the argument is one that like anybody's arguing for deep roots of war should take seriously is like we just do not have many bodies indicating that they died from lethal violence prior to about 10,000 years ago. Um, so the way I think about this is a couple. One, you look at so when we think of war, we typically think massacres. We think multiple bodies. We think it's something larger. The typical pattern of war for hunter-gatherers is just a single victim, maybe two, not attacked to their camp, but attacked opportunistically at the forest, at the river, in the savannah. So this is the typical pattern. So instead of finding multiple bodies, we should expect to be finding isolated bodies. The problem in Africa is where I know most about the archaeological record is there's just barely any human remains from the Paleolithic. So, we think, oh, we've got tons and tons of skeletons. Well, what we have is partial skeleton. We got part of a femur, part of a crania. We've got dozens of teeth. We have a little bit of a humerus and a pelvis. But what you need bodies that are intact enough to be able to determine the cause of death, to actually be able to see skeletal injuries. So there's very, very few of these up until recently, until our population starts exploding, until they start living in sort of more dense population centers. So you would predict, even if war was the exact same during that period, you would predict around 10,000 years ago to see more skeletal remains of violence, even if the rates of war were same because you have more people. But secondly, forensic anthropology work has shown that many lethal wounds don't actually damage the skeleton.
Forensic anthropology, by the way, sounds cool.
Yeah, really cool. It's like, you can work as CSI or whatever after, but you get someone gets stabbed with a spear and it, kills them and it doesn't damage the skeleton. You find something. I think the estimates are like 20 to 30 some percent of the deaths due to lethal violence do not actually damage the skeleton enough to be able to detect that later. So this is really reducing the sort of sample size. But you certainly do. Fry and others are right that generally when you see larger population densities, when you see increased sedentism, when you see increased sociopolitical complexity, you see increasing rates of war. That's not always the pattern. There are some exceptions, but that's often the case. But I don't think that's incompatible with a deep roots perspective that war may have been important or war was important in human evolution. War has proximate triggers. Those situations may elicit those triggers more easily. It may be more easily to mobilize. It may be easier to mobilize people for more intense war when you have forms of socio-political organization, making it instead of it 4 guys that know each other, it's 40 guys that have a clear leader, then you expect war to get much more severe. And that's what it looks like the archaeological record shows. But that doesn't mean that war wasn't important in human evolution.
I think that's a great then place to move to the question about chimpanzees. As I said earlier, I think the cave painting is for me the most emotional argument for shallow rooting. Chimpanzees are the most emotionally powerful argument for the deep rooting of war. I actually think I said this in my interview with Ferguson, that we can be talking here as long as we want, but anyone looks David Attenborough, narrate 1 minute from the Kibale National Park of this raid going on, and they're just gonna forget everything we said, and it's like it feels so unbelievably familiar.
It's really freaky. It's scary, when you see how similar it looks to sort of the coalitional dynamics that you might expect a group of humans to produce.
Yeah, I mean, I need to link this particular video, but I also did link to that episode. Well, okay, I think that's the place then for me to make the counter, which is to say that yes, chimpanzees are capable of war, but the question was never about whether humans are capable of war, but the perspective that someone who just skims through the chimpanzee literature and especially its popularization might get is that chimpanzees are these kind of creatures that are hardwired to immediately, if they can, attack members of an outgroup. This happens all the time. The wars are like the thing you expect if you study chimpanzees. But if you are someone like Brian Ferguson, takes a bit of a skeptical eye, reads through every single documented account of a chimpanzee killing another chimpanzee, what you find is that you have 2 wars, which have very interesting causes for the wars, but you have 2 wars. And outside of those 2 wars, a killing of an outgroup member happens once in around 30 years of observation. And even within those wars, if I remember his data right, it's around 1 kill per year of observation, a little bit over one per year. And so even in chimpanzees, first of all, it's not nearly as kind of universally present as some accounts would make it out to be. And secondly, when we look at when it occurs, these are not very pristine environments. It's not as simple as immediately when humans go in, you start having war. But there is a story to be told. For example, when Jane Goodall witnessed the chimpanzee war at Gombe National Park, there's a very interesting story behind it on how you start giving bananas to both groups, then you stop giving it to one group, you only give bananas to this other group. Basically what Ferguson said was that, look, it's not human impact that makes chimpanzees do war, but it is any human impact which pits one chimpanzee group against another. So yeah, they're capable of doing war, but it's nowhere near as big part of the kind of chimpanzee nature as we might think from some popular or even scholarly accounts, you would say. So I guess that's the counter. Your turn.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question. If you did the same experiment that Jane Goodall did, provisioning bonobos, would you see groups of bonobo males going out, attacking solitary bonobos from the other group and killing them?
Good question. And you would say that the answer is no.
Yeah, it's possible. If you took a group of, let's say, rabbits, for instance, in a resource scarce environment, just to pick like a really trivial example, and you put lots and lots of fresh grass and dandelion stems out, where the rabbits form coalitions and just start killing each other over them. No, they idea is they wouldn't. They're not capable of it. So if you're capable of it, right? So if you're going to say chimpanzees are capable of it, when did that capability evolve? It didn't evolve with Jane Goodall starting to put bananas out. It didn't evolve with Nagogo getting this larger population, right? So presumably it evolved sometime in the species evolutionary history prior to Jane Goodall showing up in 1970 or 68 or whenever it was.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think that let's think about slavery. I mean, I again, we touched upon this earlier. It's a bit tricky when talking about possible enslavement in hunter-gatherers, but it's at least a possibility. And enslaving people did not occur before you started having settled societies. Let's say that it's not an impossible hypothesis. Well, you could then say something like slavery is not something has deep roots in human history. It emerges very late. Yeah, the capacity for it emerged with our big brains and our, 5 digits and all of those things, but the action only emerges later on. And I think that that's what kind of someone like Ferguson would say about war is that, yeah, of course, both chimps and humans have the capacity because of all of the kinds of things that we have, capacity to work in coalitions, capacity to use violence as a problem solving mechanism. But it doesn't mean that it has had this really um, this constant presence throughout the evolutionary history.
So what was the selective mechanism? What was the selective pressure for chimpanzees to form these tight coalitions where they attack lone individuals from another group, right? Like this is it seems to me to be a very sort of specific behavior. You don't see
Yeah,
and I don't know the record well enough, but you have, provisioning, more resource stress. You don't see all different types of aggression increasing. You don't see, say, infanticide increasing. You don't see rates of male aggression. And I could be wrong on this, but I've never any accounts of it. Female aggression, female infanticide. You see one particular type of aggression. They're not all male, but they're mostly male. They're male biased, where in particular there's a significant imbalance of power. So, I think the average is around 7 adults against a single victim. Males from another group are much more likely to be targeted than females. So it looks to be the type of behavior that's adaptive. And you would expect, I don't dispute. I think on an evolutionary model, you would expect it to increase in certain conditions, such as when you have more males. You would expect it potentially to increase in times of resource abundance because the more males you have, the easier it is to form coalitions. I don't have a problem with Ferguson's claim that, some of chimpanzee raiding or killings may be exacerbated by human impacts, but that doesn't mean
yeah,
it strikes me as just completely implausible to think that this wasn't a behavior that has evolutionary significance and likely
yeah.
predate humans. Surely chimpanzees, we know there's plenty of populations that aren't around today of all different types of primates. Surely they face resource scarcity in the past. And
Yes, that's exactly what I said to him. That's exactly what I said, and I don't remember his answer word to word, but his answer was something like, "Yeah, I'm not against the possibility that there was like something had happened once in like a long time ago, and some chimpanzees had warlike dynamics. Then it's just that it's not like a big deal in the same way as you would think. Or what he would say that I think what he would say is that it's if you only read like famous papers like Wrangham and Glowacki 2012, you will get the impression that that's just what chimpanzees do. It's chronic, it's constant, they do it all the time, and that's not what it really looks like if you go through the record. So what do you think? I think that there is the word constant and chronic in, for example, the famous paper that you wrote with Richard Wrangham.
yeah, it's been a long time since I've read that paper, so I can't quote myself. I can't quote myself on it, but my understanding from talking to a lot of different chimpanzee researchers is that male chimpanzees really have a psychology where they're not capable of tolerating other male chimpanzees. Zoos have a enormous problem of introducing strange chimpanzee males to each other. It looks like that reaction is significantly less and bonobos. And like, where does that come from? Right. Presumably, if they have that psychology, presumably it's the result of something in their evolutionary history.
But then couldn't that be interestingly used actually as an argument kind of either way? Because you could then also say that, well, in this case, humans are much more like bonobos because we're even more, open to the strangers, like you said earlier. And so maybe whatever is driving chimpanzees to war is a very interesting story. But that's a completely different story. Superficially, it looks so unbelievably similar when you look at the video. Please, anyone who's listening, to take the 3 minutes to watch the video in the links. It is just it's really remarkable. But yet you see what I mean is that in the way that because chimpanzees are so unlike humans in this kind of uh, what you just described as kind of complete male incapacity of the males to interact with strange males, whatever dynamics, whatever is driving us to war are actually completely separate. It's sort of superficially similar. What would you think of that?
Yeah. So you just brought up the 2012 paper, which I wrote as a grad student, and I think it's a fantastic paper, but my thinking has since evolved. Sometimes I wish the way scientific publishing worked is you could like go back and like revise your ideas like directly on, but I don't think chimpanzees are a great model to understand human intergroup relationships or even, the evolution of war in recent human history, say, since, the late Pleistocene or say the last 150,000 years. We are so fundamentally different. Our psychology is so fundamentally different that I think if your starting point, in the last, let's say, since the genus Homo is chimpanzees, I think you're going to have a really hard time understanding how we are such fantastic, wild cooperators. I can walk out of my office and I can see, 1,000 people that are strange males, and I'm not going to have any cortisol spike.
It's funny. I don't know if it was because I was preparing for this interview mentally, but I was just seeing friend for coffee. Um, at London, around London City, today, and just walking from Farringdon Station towards the Barbican, and I mean, for people not familiar with London, that it's a busy area. It's a busy area, and I had this kind of when you just suddenly look with new eyes at something. And I was looking around myself. I was like, I love living in a big city because I can witness this every day. People of all sorts, from all walks of life, from all sorts of backgrounds, just doing their thing. And I don't know. And I was just smiling walking on the street.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and there's no world, in which you could imagine chimpanzees doing something like this. So a lot of our psychology is much more bonobo-like, but bonobo-like compared taken to an extreme. So I don't think, if you want to understand the roots of war, really how humans do are the roots of intergroup relationships. I don't think chimpanzees are a good model. Nonetheless, I think it's really useful for thinking about our intergroup relationships, which include both cooperation and competition, war and trade, or war and friendship, to take a behavioral ecological approach and think about costs and benefits. And there were certainly costs and benefits to be there. It seems very plausible that there were costs and benefits within the evolution of Homo for sometimes lethal intergroup violence, just as there would have been significant costs and benefits for intergroup trade, which is why you can have the evolution of a species that has like, this remarkable capacity, both for killing, but also for cooperation, for altruism.
There is going to be debate. We're not going to solve the debate today. I don't think that necessarily is our goal, but I think anyone who's listening to this will hopefully feel like they have an enriched understanding of what we do know and we don't know. But I don't want us to just talk about what we know and what we don't know, but also talk about why it matters if it does. And I think one of the things when I've been going back and looking at the episode, for example, I did with Fry, that I think I kind of regret not pushing back more is the kind of suggestion that if you're a deep rooter, if you think that war goes forever back, that somehow, I think you said it like sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, these people say that, well, war is kind of always going to be with us and we can't do much about it. I don't think that's true. I don't think looking at people, like Jane Goodall is not exactly like the, ambassador of global militarism. And I think that this is a separate question. I mean, I think we all would like world peace, as naive as that sounds, and I think that it's unfortunate if anyone who approaches this debate is like, am I a peace person or a war person? If I'm a peace person, then I'm going to be a shallow rooter. If I'm a war person, I'm going to be a deep rooter. And given that, what is at stake?
So you're exactly right. There's a tendency to think that, if you think war is somehow a product of our evolved psychology, people may say then, oh, it's inevitable. But in my experience, people don't actually think that at all. I know from my own personal biography that when I originally decided to study war for my PhD, I read Demonic Males. I was at a coffee shop in San Francisco at the same time I was reading Samantha Power's A Problem from Hell on the genocide and America's role in the genocides of the 20th century. And I was like, oh my gosh, we should study something. We should use this evolutionary framework to try to understand why it is we do the things we do today, and ideally design institutions to prevent them. I was motivated by a real sense of optimism and a desire to design societies in such a way that we could minimize war. And I thought that the only way we could really do it was by actually understanding, by being really honest with ourselves about where does it come, how much of it is biological, how much of it is cultural, how much say do we have as a society to engineer our structures and institutions to say bring out the better angels of our nature. And I think many of the deep rooters would probably feel very similarly to me that only by really understanding the causes of war and to what is the role of our psychology and our biology can we figure out how to prevent it. And certainly we can prevent it to some degree. We've got, we're going through this period. We have been of the long peace. We've had massive reductions in war. And there's no reason to think that we've done the best we can, that we can't near a society where we drive it to near zero.
I think our world in data has a partially very optimistic and partially very sad data set on this, where you really see the dramatic decrease in war-related casualties for decades and decades and decades, except for the last decade. And it's been a very bad decade. It's been a very bad 10
Yeah.
years. And it's not going to a good direction at the moment. But what do we do then? You meet your young self in that San Francisco coffee shop, and it's like, "You're so old, Luke. Tell me what we do here.
Yeah.
What do we do?"
For one, I think a critical part is having discussions like this, that we're having, where we're not afraid to actually look at ourselves in the mirror and figure out what is human nature, whether it's pertaining to war or other forms of aggression or parenting or any injustice, anything. I think it's really important to take a sort of evolutionary approach to thinking about the causes of that, or a biological approach. I don't think we should shy away from it. And I think, I don't have the answer of how would I tell young Luke to write policy to prevent genocide, but I don't think you're going to be able to unless you really understand unless you understand why humans do what they do. And there's clearly a significant part of our behavior that's driven by our psychologies, and our psychology is the product of evolution, and they are culturally labile. We can push them around with culture, which is amazing and incredibly powerful. So the challenge is to figure out what it takes to push them around to create a world that we want, which is hopefully one without war.
But tell me more. I mean, you have a whole paper which I found was a really fascinating paper on this idea of the evolution of peace. So not the evolution of a lack of war, that's pretty normal in the animal kingdom, but the evolution of the capacity for groups to interact intensely with each other without ending up having coalitionary violence. So you've thought about this stuff, you've thought about this
Yeah,
stuff more
yeah.
than I have. So where does our capacity for peace come from? Where do you see our capacity for peace at its best? What are the moments that we should kind of cling on as inspirations, seeing this is what we do at our best when we're building peace, and this is what we need more of? And maybe those can be clues for where to find solutions.
Yeah. So those are big, meaty questions. Peace partly comes from the same place war does, the ability to assess cost and benefits. But the critical part of peace is that you get the incentives aligned for most group members such that they favor cooperation. So some ways to do that are like increasing interdependence. And Fry, for instance, written a lot about that, that if you can find ways to increase the interdependence between groups, you push the scales to favor in cooperation.
So this is the basic European Union method.
Yeah, yeah. You have to find ways to align incentives, but you have to do a couple of other things, right? You have to really create institutions that monitor bad behavior, right? That sanction bad behavior. So you have to be able to prevent aggression, right? You do that by aligning incentives, but one of the ways that you really need to do is you need institutions that can strong institutions that can prevent aggression when it happens. But then crucially, like aggression or intergroup conflict is a natural part of social species. Like as long as you have social species, you're going to have conflict. But when it occurs, you need mechanisms to restore relationships.
One thing that I often think, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, is how often are humans able to bridge differences between group differences Individuals, I honestly, I have like eternal hope in human individuals. I think that anything is doable between two individuals. But with groups, there are these wonderful examples. Look at France and Germany, going from enemies to close friends. And how do you do it? You do it by interdependence, trade. European Union. One part of the story is this kind of interdependence. But then there is the kind of nastier part of the story, which is that there is a camp who says that the European Union did not achieve peace on the European continent, did not achieve this unification by integrating Western Europe as much as by focusing on an external enemy, the Eastern Bloc. You see this in, if you look at, for example, Fry's article on peace systems, he talks also about the five nations. No, I can't remember the technical terms, but that story from Native American history. There's a nice way to read it all. They fight against each other, and then they have a symbolic thing where they bury the fighting axe. Yeah, but then there's the other story, which is that they did that for one reason only, which was that suddenly you had a bunch of very powerful European militarists knocking on their door, and they wanted to unify. And so, how many historical examples do we have of like countries that have had hostile relations, being able to just via positive vibes without invoking an external enemy to find peace?
Yeah, so when you were originally talking, I was like, "Oh, the United States and Japan, the United States and South Korea," but those were all driven by the same way, common enemy. But what about the United States and Canada, for instance, in the 1700s,
Oh,
right? There
great.
was
Okay.
between war in Canada, and I feel at some point there was like discussion about invading. At least I've read on like some blog, like why didn't the U.S. invade Canada or the United States and Mexico? For instance, a lot of the Western United States used to be territory of Mexico that the U.S., annexed after our war. But now I would say like we have, very positive relationships with both groups. But certainly it's true that an external threat, nothing will drive in-group cohesion like an external threat, whether that external threat is war or 9/11 or a natural disaster such as a hurricane or a typhoon.
Yeah. What is the one thing that you can have Democrats and Republicans nowadays going on? It's
Yeah, China, but I know in something I was reading, they were like, what would bring the world together is an alien invasion.
absolutely right. I completely agree. Yes. Yes.
China wouldn't matter, it would be one world.
China is interesting though, now that we're on the topic. I've been just reading David Kang's book. I'm also doing an episode on war and peace with him. He's an international relations, international politics guy, completely different field. But he looks at East Asian security, and he's written about the East Asian history. And what's really fascinating there is that if you look at, for example, Chinese history, you find a lot of wars. But they're almost always either attacks from the West or China expanding to the West. And from the conception of the states of Vietnam, Japan, Korea, China, so the Vietnamese state as he conceives it is around 1,000 years old. For example, the border between Vietnam and China hasn't budged. It's the same as it has been. It's the same
Okay,
today as it has been
interesting.
1,000 years ago. And there's like these individual moments, like when Japan goes kind of wild and attacks China in the late 1500s, attacks Korea to attack China. But those are like, they're so rare that when they happen, no one believes that it's happening. And it is a nice example of there was no external enemy.
Interesting to think about the example you gave, Vietnam and China and border remaining static for, 1,000 years. It's fascinating.
And the Vietnamese would, by the way, push back because the traditional story in Vietnam is that China is the constant bully in Vietnamese history. And Kang's argument is that, well, no, not after the year around 1000 or before the 20th century, when again China attacked 1978, there was a war. And then there is a really, really long peace. And so all the kind of national myth in Vietnam about fighting China like the transistors, that's true, but that's kind of in the pre-Vietnamese state era. So it's really cool. And he has several books. He has one book is called East Asia Before the West, but they all kind of they use this really incredibly unique dynamics of these East Asian countries just to show how limited some of the very deterministic Europe-based theories in international relations are. So I think, I mean, yeah, I hope you listen to the episode when it comes out. I think you.
I look forward to it. I mean, there's so much we don't know about the world just by the virtue of, living in North America or Europe. You're focused on there when the world is enormous.
And I think that this does kind of have a bit of a link to what we talked about earlier with hunter-gatherers also, and just in the sense that it is very, I think, easy to want to find this one model that's like perfect, whether it's Europe or whether it's something completely different, mobile hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
But wherever, I mean, there are, I guess, the kind of, yeah, humans are capable of a lot of kinds of things. War, peace, and a lot of things in between would maybe be the short
Yeah.
summary.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are incredibly flexible.
Yeah.
It's, if we're anything, we are just so, so flexible.
Let me throw you a quote from
Yeah.
memory and see what you think about it. I remember hearing Richard Rhodes, historian Richard Rhodes. I think he was talking about Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. Say something which I heard years ago, and it stuck with me, which is that he says something like, "Look, humans are capable of using violence to solve their problems. Humans are capable of doing other things to solve their problems. And if you want to reduce violence, what it means is that you give people ways to solve their problems without violence. As simple as that." And he basically, I think what he was there saying is that we shouldn't really try to think too much of whether violence is like, natural or unnatural. Like it's just part of the tool set that we have, and we are very flexible beings. So any reactions, any comments on that?
Yeah. So I agree with it in theory that, humans, violence is a tool for people to advance their, their aims or their goals, and you can give them off ramps. You can give them tools that will satisfy their aims without violence. Nonetheless, it strikes me as really important to know about the biological bases of violence, because who do you give those tools to? Why is violence, for instance, if violence is randomly distributed across the landscape, you give everybody the same tools. But in reality, violence is produced mostly by men. So maybe that means you want to focus mostly on preventing violence by men. And it's not just like random among men, it's random among a subset of men of a certain age, typically. So it seems to me that there's a really important reason to think about it. Violence may be exacerbated in certain social conditions, such as like when people are parts of tight coalitions, when there's not much interdependence, when you have more atomistic societies or worldviews. That these are all, things that you predict from evolutionary theory that are supported by empirical evidence, that if you're just like randomly giving tools across the landscape, you're not going to be effectively optimizing the distribution of those tools. And that's where like understanding the biology of violence is really important.
So would you say that people who read Fry, Ferguson, etc., shallow rooters, what might they get wrong in practice?
Well, to me, it's not totally clear what the theory of violence they're advancing is. What is the theory of war, right? Noting a relationship between socio-political complexity and population density and war, that's an observation. That's not a theory. Our societies are only going to get more complex, but I don't think we're necessarily going to have higher rates of war. So what does predict war? What does predict peace? What does predict cooperation? And that's really where you want, you want rich theory to do that. And I think that's where evolution has an important role.
Well, I think that's a good moment to start coming to a close. So the final question always, how has all your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
Yeah, it's I was thinking about this question before we met. On the one hand, when I think about my studies over the past couple of, past decade on war, peace, human nature, I feel really optimistic. Like we clearly have the capacity to reduce violence. We clearly have the capacity to go long periods of time without war, and probably to extinguish war. So that makes me very excited. But on the other hand, in some sense, I'm not that much of an optimist, because when I think about the things we really cherish about the world, peace, human rights, freedom, education, science, dignity for life, these all depend on norms and institutions. But that fact alone makes them fragile, right? They can be easily perturbed. There's no natural reason we have to continue to uphold or support or rebuild these institutions to maintain their norms. And it seems like a critical part of maintaining the sort of institutions that allow us to live in the world we want to live in is that people value them and they're willing to enforce them. And that seems fragile. The shadow of history, as people say, is short. So it means we either have to design institutions that are strong enough that, they can overcome human limitations, our sort of short historical memory, or we have to keep relearning the value of those institutions. And that's obviously a world we don't necessarily want because it's a world where we rebuild them after conflicts. And it looks like, in some ways our society maybe, with the increasing tensions between China and the US may be very alarmed that, about what's it going to look like in 10 years. So I feel both optimistic, like, culture is incredibly powerful. We can build whatever world we want, but it's also fragile to maintain that.
Professor Luke Glowacki, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, that was it for today. If you want to learn more, there are obvious places to go to. You can go to episode 8 with Douglas Fry. You can go to episode 25 with Brian Ferguson to hear their perspectives. And you can stay tuned for the next episode, which will be with David Kahn, about what East Asian history can teach us about war and peace. Stay tuned and show your support by subscribing to the podcast and subscribing to the On Humans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com, where you will also get more juicy materials on humans straight to your inbox. And finally, if you're a long-term listener, I hope that maybe this tilted the balance and convinced you that it's worth joining the wonderful group of people who make this financially possible at patreon.com/onhumans. But whoever you are, wherever you are, I'm glad that you tuned in today. I wish you a really wonderful rest of the day, and I hope that you tune in next time. Until then, take care.